I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, I'm joined by Marsha Barrett, the author of Nelson Rockefeller's Dilemma, The Fight to Save Moderate Republicanism. What lessons can each party learn from New York's former governor? Our first guest is the journalist, author, political analyst, and contributing New York Times opinion writer, Jonathan Alter. This week, he analyzed the electoral math behind candidate Kamala Harris's choice of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Jonathan taking a break from a recording session for his upcoming book, American Reckoning. Welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us. July 29th, you wrote in the New York Times that not only should Kamala Harris choose Tim Walz, but she should not choose Mark Kelly or Josh Shapiro as her running mate. Why did you make those three recommendations?
Because I thought, Sam, that actually Walz, as I think the world is now learning, is an excellent candidate for giving them more than one route to what needs to be, I think, a fairly convincing victory in order to prevent real mischief by the MAGA folks after a close election. So Walz is a talented candidate. He appeals to rural America, where the Democrats are never going to win, but if they can cut the margins in rural America that the Republicans now enjoy, they have a really good shot at winning this election.
And what do Kelly and Shapiro contribute by not being on the ticket?
Well, my hope is that Kelly and Shapiro can stay in their home states for the duration. If they had gone on the ticket, they would have had to fly to fundraisers in California, New York, campaign in a bunch of other states. And now both Kelly and Shapiro can just stay really close to home, and Kamala Harris will come into their states at least once a week, and they can campaign and lend their stature to the Harris-Walz ticket. And I think, in some ways, being there in the state, urging their people to vote for the Democratic ticket, as Josh Shapiro did in a fine speech on the night Walz was selected, they can do the Democratic ticket a lot of good, even if they're not on the ticket themselves.
Jonathan, you also recommended earlier on that Kamala Harris would benefit if she had some competition for the nomination, perhaps a mini primary. She didn't. She was more or less anointed. How does that affect her status running against Donald Trump?
I think it's fine. I mean, I would have preferred that there be a little bit of competition. I had a lot of company in that. Barack Obama preferred that because there was a concern that she not be seen as having been handed this. But what happened, Sam, in the days after President Biden stood down is that there was just this tremendous outpouring of support for Harris. And she handled herself flawlessly as she moved to unify the Democratic Party. So there's really no consequence to her not having had any competition. And yes, some Republicans might bellyache about that as if, it wasn't fair in the other party when, look, all of these delegates were Biden-Harris delegates. So, they already showed their support before she went to the top of the ticket. And I think there's basically nothing that I would criticize about the way the Democrats have handled themselves in the last couple of weeks. And that's mostly a tribute to Kamala Harris. Her stump speech is first rate. Her decision on her vice president was a smart one. She's reached out to unify the Democratic Party. And so I don't know if they're going to win, but they're doing everything possible to make winning a real, real likely possibility here. It's too close to call now. but they have performed flawlessly. And Sam, you know, I'm normally very, very critical of these candidates in one fashion or another. And I'm sure there will be things to criticize about them as time moves on. But so far, so good for the Democrats.
There'll be things to criticize, and naturally, it's a long way between now and the election. Who is
Correct.
Tim Walz? Is he a moderate? Is he a liberal, a progressive? What does he stand for?
Well, I like to think of him as a liberal because,
Oh my God, nobody calls themselves a liberal anymore, do
I
they?
know. I know. I think he calls himself a progressive. And my problem with that word is that it in the last 10 years, it carries a little bit too much baggage to be that useful. But he's really an old-fashioned prairie liberal. And this used to be a very common figure in American politics. Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale from his state. They're from the Democratic Farm Labor Party, which is still an important force in Minnesota politics. And they come out of a liberalism that is actually really popular right now in the United States. But it's important to understand that Walz, when he was in the House, he had a moderate voting record. There's nothing extreme about this guy. He worked routinely across the aisle when he was in Congress. He was considered in the top 10 of most bipartisan legislators. So I don't think that the labels really do a lot of good. He's a common sense, moderate liberal. And is he going to, do something that pleases Republicans? Not necessarily, not likely, which is why I think that Harris, to win this election, she needs to make some other gestures to the center to convince suburban voters and rural voters that she's not an old-fashioned, San Francisco liberal, if you know what that means, sort of like really to the left. She's not. Her tough on crime record and a lot of other things refute the garbage that is right now being directed at her from the right wing. But it would help her to say, for instance, that, she would welcome Republicans in her cabinet, as Barack Obama had a Republican Secretary of Defense twice, Bob Gates and also Chuck Hagel, both Republicans. So I think ideally for Kamala Harris, she would convince Mitt Romney to be her Secretary of Defense after Lloyd Austin retires. He hasn't been in great health. And that would send a kind of signal that she needs. But she didn't have to do that with her vice presidential pick. It was just fine for her to select this very charming, accessible, likable candidate as her running mate.
Is there any chance a Republican like Mitt Romney would come aboard the Harris campaign?
I can't answer that question, but he has been scathing in his criticism of Donald Trump, and I can't imagine that he's made it clear that he simply can't vote for him. And if it was a national security issue where their differences really are not very significant between Romney's position on Russia and Harris's position on Russia, and everybody understands that we need to continue to make more investments in defense spending because the world has become an even more dangerous place than it was a few years ago. So I do think there is room for a Robert Gates, Chuck Hagel, Republican in the Harris cabinet. And I think it would be a very important signal for her to send to reassure some voters who maybe would have preferred that Josh Shapiro, who's more moderate, be on the ticket. And it's just something that smart general candidates do, and she is smart, and that is move to the center. And I think Trump's failure to move to the center at his convention was quite harmful to him. He said he was going to be a unifier. He talked about it, read some lines that had been written for him for 15 minutes about unifying and being president of all the people. And then he just delivered this rancid red meat, his stump speech. And, the swing voters in the suburbs, they might not be vegetarians, Sam, but they don't like rancid red meat either from the extreme. And that's what Trump was giving them. I think Harris will be smarter about this and move a little bit to the center in the next 3 months, and that will help her.
Jonathan, a last question. Raised some questions about his use of the word weird to describe some of the opposition. He said he meant only Trump and Vance, but it's been compared to Hillary Clinton's mention of a basket of deplorables to describe her opponents. How serious is that? What does it suggest about Tim Walz?
I think it's almost all upside. He's clearly not talking about his friends and neighbors who are, Republicans who he's worked with and lived with his whole life. And I think when he draws the distinction between Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and, maybe Stephen Miller, the weird guy who runs immigration policy for Trump, referring to them as weird is quite different than deplorable. I mean, Hillary Clinton said half of all Trump voters were deplorable. That's a very different kind of statement. And I don't think this will hurt Walz at all. And I think it's a kind of an argument that might work if Walz was from the coastal elite, but he's not. He's from the heartland. And so he's clearly not everybody on the other side weird. That's just not the kind of thing that tracks with what we know about Governor Walz. So I don't think this will be an issue. I think there will be other things that will become an issue because the Republicans are very good at staying on the same talking points. So when they decide that their focus groups are finding they're getting traction on something, they will all jump on that message at once. Right now, they're trying to make it seem like, he left the National Guard when they were going to go to Iraq, when actually they had not been deployed to Iraq. That would not have happened until quite a bit after Walz left the Guard after 24 years of service. And so for Donald Trump, who literally said that fear of sexually transmitted diseases when he was dating in the 60s and 70s was, quote, my Vietnam. And he got out of serving in the military with bone spurs that we have not heard of in all the years since. He and his running mate are not in a very good position to attack Tim Walz, 24 years of service in the Army National Guard. So that's the kind of thing that they're throwing against the wall, see whether it sticks. The guy who swift-boated John Kerry is running Trump's campaign. So 20 years ago, exactly in August of 2004, that military, trying to make his military record look bad, that worked for them 20 years ago. It's not going to work for them now. So they will try a series of other things. They're trying to call him Tampon Tim because of something that related to, being respectful of transgender people. They'll try anything. Most of it won't work. Some of it that does work a little bit, they'll then go whole hog on that. And those will be issues that the Harris-Walz campaign will have to respond to. But so far, they're not getting any traction on any of this, Sam.
Jonathan Alter, contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and the author of the forthcoming American Reckoning. You can order it now and get a head start on the book. And coming up next, whatever happened to Rockefeller Republicanism? Donald Trump's rise to power has challenged the Democratic Party, but it's been no picnic for Republicans. What's left of progressives and even centrists have been marginalized, and not for the first time. Marsha E. Barrett is the author of Nelson Rockefeller's Dilemma, The Fight to Save Moderate Republicanism. It's a timely and insightful historical perspective. Professor Barrett teaches history at the University of Illinois. And Professor Barrett, you seem to say that in losing the battle for the progressive soul of the party, Nelson Rockefeller sort of set the stage for white grievance populism. How responsible is he for Donald Trump?
Well, there's certainly a long period of time and a good deal of distance between Rockefeller and Donald Trump, especially even with their rhetoric and their policies. But I see a similarity there in that when Nelson Rockefeller failed to sort of create this cross-class, bipartisan, multiracial coalition, this constituency, when that failed, he looked to see who were his most likely voters. And those most likely voters in his mind were white suburbanites. And as that community became more antagonistic to US cities and the people who lived in those cities, they began to embrace and call for policies that were punitive toward those urban communities. So rather than bringing people together, Rockefeller at the end of his career started forwarding policies that drove a wedge between them, and made a case that urban communities had received too much, right? New York State had been too generous and now needed to pull back, in part because these people had let the state down, let him down, cheated the entire community. And presenting urban poor communities in that way, I think does help to create this atmosphere that has continued to grow and become more popular, and then more politicians were able to take advantage of it.
Whatever he actually believed in personally, could he have gotten elected as a liberal, progressive Republican in New York without taking those positions? And could he have gotten elected nationally, which he never did, with those positions?
Well, those liberal positions he had, he was able to win election in 1958, in 1962, and I think it was more viable for him to make that case in the state of New York. But really, throughout that time, though, there was a good deal of opposition amongst conservative Republicans, and he was really able to overcome that, I think, by and large, because, well, one, conservative Republicans thought that, conservatives could not win statewide election in New York, but also because Nelson Rockefeller had so much money, that he was always going to run well-funded campaigns. He was going to blanket television with advertisements, newspaper. He went above and beyond any other opponent. And I think it really did help to keep him viable in the state of New York, but it wasn't going to work in the nation more broadly amongst Republicans.
We saw the rise of conservatism in New York, the Conservative Party, the election of Senator James Buckley. What Rockefeller told, as you report in the book in a letter to Jackie Robinson, was that he hadn't changed, but circumstances had changed. How big a difference is there in that? Had he changed, or in fact, was he correct that circumstances had changed?
Well, circumstances had changed. And I can't say if Rockefeller changed personally at his core. There are people in his circle, people even his family, who made the case that he never really changed personally. It was about circumstances. But what I think is most important, rather than looking at what his internal sort of thinking and life was look at the policy and look at the rhetoric. When it comes to welfare reform, for example, it's very easy to make the case that the state budget in New York was overextended. It would get sort of even worse after he was in office. But if he needed to pull back on those policies, in terms of investing in social services, say the state just ran out of money. Make an economic case. Don't claim that welfare recipients are stealing from the state and abusing the system when there was no evidence that that was the case. So I think the rhetoric, whether he had changed or not, the rhetoric changed, the policy changed, who he targeted as the enemy and the problem, that changed.
So did he betray his own cause, or did he change his mind? I mean, it's hard to look into someone's mind, especially all these years later, but was this a cynical attempt to win votes, or had he changed his philosophy somewhat because circumstances had changed?
I think that his sort of just his drive to be president, right, to make the state of New York his platform for national office, led him to, right, in terms of, I guess you could say, with his moderation as well, right? He saw himself from the very beginning as someone who drew from more liberal and conservative ideas and policies and brought them together to the middle. And so even at the end of his career in New York, even when he had passed and advocated for really punitive laws, polling amongst Republicans and Americans also saw, revealed that he was considered a moderate. So it seemed that his sort of movement on these issues, sort of his movement to the right, did succeed in that many people did still consider him a moderate. Others still would just call him a liberal, as if nothing had changed, over that 10-year period or more. So whether it's cynical or not, I mean, it's difficult to say, right, as you noted. But I think that, maybe at his core, right, he believed that if he could get into office, right, then he could do good, maybe for all of these people that he, that, in a state of New York or in the nation. But after you've made this case that people are, stealing and cheating the system, I'm not sure how you could get into office and then help those people. So.
And politicians make a lot of rationalizations, and do they really change their stripes at any time? But Rockefeller, who I covered extensively when he was governor and vice president, did change, certainly, as you say, in his rhetoric, and it's hard to know how much of that was just trying to win over the right, who he never was going to win over. They just hated him. But you do say something that's kind of harsh in your judgment, maybe perfectly true, an unprincipled search for relevancy. Do you stick by that?
I think in his late career, right, that final year in office as governor, his time in the vice presidency where he was, searching for support and some acceptance from conservative Southerners who were often new Republicans who now had all of this power in the party. And he's going out, to make speeches in the South, for example, as vice president, where he's making, basically telling them, I'm sorry. Everything I said about an active government that could help people in a modern society was wrong. And even at one point said, maybe it was just because I was chasing votes, but now I've seen the error in my ways. And for someone like him who for so long had, advocated for, government doing good in society, it just that's where I say it seems unprincipled. It's hard to really square, those differences, 'cause it really is very stark at the end of his career.
And as the New York Times wrote, at the time he did everything but talk with a drawl when he was down south, and the Republican ticket, Gerald Ford, dumped him anyway. Talk about campaign spending, of which there was a great deal at that time with few disclosure laws. Do we have any sense as to how much he actually spent in 2024 dollars and how that compares to what spending is today?
I haven't done the calculations in terms of comparing today to then. It's a really good question. But what I will say, what was interesting about that time, where you mentioned the lack of disclosure laws, it really it wasn't clear when he was, seeking office in 58 and 62, 66, how much money was being spent exactly.
And of course, that was mostly his family's money, too.
Right, a lot of, yes, from his family members. But what we do know is actually what we do know, a lot of that information is from the congressional hearings when he was being considered for Gerald Ford's vice presidency, and he had to then reveal much more of his finances than he ever had before. So that's where we know that he, some of the more details about not only money that he spent on his campaigns, but money that he gave to various Republican groups and Republicans sort of throughout the state of New York. Sort of everyone is a little bit more flush with cash when Nelson Rockefeller was in office, and that really just disappears and dries up after he leaves the governorship, in part because you do see new laws passed that require more transparency and a little bit more structure in terms of how you finance campaigns.
And the staff that he subsidized, raising a question of whether they were more loyal to him or to the state offices they held. Marsha E Barrett, the author of Nelson Rockefeller's Dilemma, The Fight to Save Moderate Republicanism. Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, my thoughts on the MTA's biggest problem, fare evasion. Nobody really knows precisely how much fare evasion is costing the MTA, but a startling statistic was cited at the transit agency's recent board meeting. Nearly half of the 2 million people who ride city buses every weekday sneak on board without paying. Officials now place the proportion of bus fare beaters at 47%, up 10 percentage points from the first 3 months of this year alone, and nearly double the 25% who didn't pay before the pandemic. That means more than $300 million in lost revenue, a lot less than what the MTA was expecting from congestion pricing tolls before Governor Hochul pulled the plug. But $300 million is even more than what fare evasion on the subway system cost. One reason people don't pay is because they can't. They're poor. So the MTA wants to expand the eligibility for its Fair Fare program. Another was the MTA's response to the pandemic. It wasn't that people were desperate, the MTA was. Bus fares were eliminated to encourage ridership. Riders were ordered to board through the back door to help keep drivers safe from COVID. A so-called Eagle team of enforcement inspectors now ride the buses, but there aren't enough of them. And if the inspectors issue a summons, don't count on that unpaid fare being clawed back. The MTA considered hiring a psychologist to analyze fare beaters' motives. It doesn't take an expert. Mass transit costs too much for poor people. Peer pressure won't work without enough peers. And how many other ways are left in this big brother world to beat the system? There's no more free lunch, but half the city's bus passengers are taking the MTA for a ride. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.